The evening sun cast long shadows through the windows of La Maison, one of downtown's most prestigious restaurants. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above white-clothed tables where Los Angeles' elite gathered to see and be seen. The air hummed with the gentle clink of fine china and the murmur of sophisticated conversation. Through the meticulously polished glass doors stepped a man in his 50s, wearing a worn but clean button-down shirt and faded jeans. His shoes, though well-maintained, showed signs of age. The maître d' glanced up, his practiced smile faltering slightly as he assessed the newcomer. Carl Morrison, La Maison's owner, stood nearby in his tailored Italian suit, watching the scene unfold. His lips curled into a dismissive smirk as the man approached the podium. "Good evening," the guest said softly. "I have a reservation for one under the name James." Before the maître d' could respond, Carl stepped forward, his voice carrying just loudly enough to draw attention from nearby tables. "I believe there's been a mistake," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "La Maison has certain standards. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at the diner down the street." The restaurant fell silent. Diners paused mid-conversation, forks hovering above plates, as all eyes turned toward the confrontation. James stood quietly, his dignity intact despite the public humiliation. "I assure you I have a reservation," he repeated calmly. Carl's laugh was sharp and cruel. "A reservation in those clothes? Sir, this isn't a soup kitchen. We cater to a particular clientele, and frankly," he paused, looking James up and down with undisguised contempt, "you don't qualify." From a corner table, a solitary figure watched the exchange intently, his features partially hidden in the dim lighting. His simple black t-shirt and jeans wouldn't have passed Carl's inspection either, but no one had noticed him yet. The observer's eyes narrowed as he witnessed Carl's cruel display of superiority. James nodded slowly, his eyes meeting Carl's with quiet strength. Without a word, he turned and walked toward the door, his shoulders straight despite the weight of judgmental stares. As he left, Carl's triumphant smirk grew wider, unaware that his moment of cruelty had just set in motion events that would change everything. The maître d' shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact with both his boss and the remaining guests. Carl turned to address the room, his voice carrying an air of self-satisfaction. "Standards, ladies and gentlemen, are what separate La Maison from common establishments. We must maintain our reputation." In the corner, the mysterious observer, none other than KEANU Reeves, continued watching, his expression thoughtful. He'd witnessed more than just a cruel rejection. He'd seen the true character of both men revealed in a single moment. As he sipped his wine, a plan began forming in his mind. If this story has touched your heart, share a time when you witnessed someone being unfairly judged. Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories of kindness and redemption. The evening air grew thick with tension as whispers rippled through La Maison's dining room. "Can you believe how he treated that man?" a woman in pearls murmured to her companion. "Though one must maintain standards," her dinner partner replied with a nervous laugh, glancing around to ensure Carl wasn't within earshot. Carl strutted between tables, basking in what he perceived as approval from his upscale clientele. His polished shoes clicked against the marble floor as he made his rounds, stopping occasionally to exchange pleasantries with his most wealthy patrons. "Remember," he announced to his staff, his voice carrying deliberately through the room, "appearance is everything in this business." The maître d' nodded dutifully, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of shame. In the corner, the quiet observer shifted slightly, the movement causing light to briefly illuminate his features. KEANU Reeves sat alone, his presence somehow both magnetic and unassuming. He watched Carl's performance with deep intensity, noting how the owner's self-satisfaction seemed to fill the room like a toxic perfume. Each gesture, each condescending smile, revealed layers of arrogance that had clearly been years in the making. A young waitress named Maria approached KEANU's table, her hands trembling slightly as she refilled his water. "Is everything all right, sir?" she asked softly, her eyes darting nervously toward Carl. KEANU's kind eyes met hers. "The food is excellent," he replied, his voice gentle. Tell me, does this happen often? The waitress glanced nervously at Carl before responding. Mr. Morrison, he has very specific ideas about the restaurant's image. She hesitated, then added in a whisper, but that man, James, he's been here before. He's always kind, always tips well, even when... Her voice trailed off as Carl approached a nearby table. I trust everything is to your satisfaction? Carl asked a couple dressed in designer clothes, his tone dramatically different from the one he'd used with James. Of course, they responded, eager to demonstrate they belonged. Such a pleasure to dine somewhere that maintains its exclusivity. KEANU observed how Carl's chest puffed with pride, how his fingers brushed invisible dust from his lapel. The actor had seen this type before. People so consumed by appearances they'd forgotten what truly mattered. He took another bite of his meal, his mind already forming a plan that would shake the very foundation of Carl's carefully constructed world. As the evening progressed, more diners arrived, each carefully scrutinized by Carl. Some were welcomed with excessive enthusiasm, others with barely concealed disdain. Through it all, KEANU remained unnoticed, gathering details like pieces of a puzzle that would soon come together in ways Carl couldn't imagine. When his waitress returned, KEANU asked quietly, "What's James's story? The man from earlier?" She looked around carefully before responding. "I probably shouldn't say, but..." She paused, weighing her words. "There's more to him than Mr. Morrison could ever understand. So much more." The morning after the incident, James walked quietly through the city streets, his worn shoes carrying him toward a small food bank tucked away in a modest neighborhood. Inside, volunteers greeted him warmly, their faces lighting up with genuine respect. "Mr. Thompson!" called out Sarah, a young mother who volunteered on weekends. "We weren't expecting you today." James smiled, pulling an envelope from his jacket. "Just dropping off this month's contribution," he said softly. "And please, it's just James." What the patrons of La Maison didn't know, what Carl Morrison could never have guessed, was that James Thompson had spent the last 15 years anonymously supporting struggling families throughout the community. His modest appearance wasn't a sign of poverty, but of choice. Back at the restaurant, KEANU had returned for lunch, still maintaining his low profile. The same waitress from the previous night, Maria, served him again. As she set down his meal, he gently asked about James. "He comes in once a month," Maria explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "Always orders the cheapest item on the menu, but tips more than the meal costs. Last Christmas, when my daughter was sick and I couldn't afford her medicine..." She paused, blinking back tears. "An envelope appeared in my locker. $3,000. No note, but I knew it was him." Across town, James entered a small accounting firm where he worked as a senior partner. His office was simple, lacking the usual trappings of success. On his desk sat a framed photo of his late wife, Catherine, alongside a stack of letters from families he'd helped. "Your monthly reports, Mr. Thompson," his assistant said, placing a folder on his desk, "and the foundation's accounts are ready for review." James nodded, thumbing through the papers that detailed his quiet philanthropic empire. After inheriting his father's successful business, he'd chosen to live modestly, channeling most of his wealth into helping others. Catherine always believed wealth was a responsibility, not a privilege, he murmured to himself, touching his wife's photo. Their last conversation before her passing had been about continuing their mission of anonymous giving. "Keep their dignity intact," she'd insisted. "Help them stand tall." That philosophy had guided James ever since, leading him to create a network of support that touched hundreds of lives. Yet to the world, to people like Carl Morrison, he was just another shabby customer unworthy of respect. La Maison's kitchen buzzed with tension as staff gathered for the evening briefing. Carl stood before them, adjusting his silk tie with manicured fingers. "Last night's incident was unfortunate," he began, his tone dismissive. "But it served as an excellent example of maintaining our standards." Maria, still shaken from sharing James's story with KEANU, spoke up. "Sir, he was a paying customer with a reservation." Her voice trembled, but held firm. "Shouldn't we treat everyone with respect?" Carl's eyes narrowed. "Respect is earned, Maria. This establishment caters to Los Angeles' finest. We can't let just anyone walk through those doors." He gestured to his own immaculate appearance. "Image is everything." The staff shifted uncomfortably, dividing like oil and water. Some nodded eagerly, hoping to curry favor with their boss. Others, like Maria, exchanged knowing glances, their silence heavy with disapproval. In the corner, Marcus, the head chef, slammed a pot down harder than necessary. "These standards of yours," he muttered, "they don't make the food taste better." Carl whirled around, but before he could respond, the front desk buzzed. The first customers of the evening had arrived. As the staff dispersed, Keanu watched from his now regular table, noting how some servers walked with their heads high, while others seemed to shrink into themselves. He caught Maria's eye and gestured for her to approach. "Your usual, sir?" she asked, trying to maintain her professional composure. Keanu nodded, then added quietly, "Tell me about Marcus, the chef." Maria glanced toward the kitchen. "He's worked here 20 years. Started as a dishwasher, Mr. Morrison. He treats Marcus like he's still one." A busboy nearby dropped a glass, the crash echoing through the restaurant. Carl emerged immediately, his face reddening. "You idiotic boy!" he shouted. "Do you know how much these glasses cost? More than you make in a week." The young busboy, barely 18, fought back tears as he knelt to clean up the mess. Without a word, Keanu stood and moved to help, but Maria caught his arm. "Please," she whispered, "don't draw attention. Not yet." Keanu settled back, his jaw tight as he watched the scene unfold. Carl's tirade continued, each word driving a deeper wedge between him and his staff. Finally, Marcus emerged from the kitchen, his chef's coat spotless despite the dinner rush. "That's enough," he said firmly. "The boy made a mistake. It happens." Carl's face twisted with rage. "You dare question my management?" he hissed. "Remember your place, Marcus. You may be head chef now, but I remember when you couldn't even properly wash a dish." The kitchen fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Marcus stood his ground, years of quiet dignity evident in his stance. "I remember too," he replied calmly. "I remember every slight, every insult, every time you made someone feel small to make yourself feel big." From his table, Keanu observed the power dynamic shifting. The staff who had previously sided with Carl now looked uncertain, while those who had remained silent found their courage in Marcus's words. "Back to work, all of you!" Carl snapped, but his voice had lost some of its authority. As the staff dispersed, Keanu made notes on his phone, adding this incident to the growing list of Carl's transgressions. The restaurant owner had no idea that his kingdom was beginning to crumble, one cruel word at a time. After the dining rush subsided, Keanu arranged to meet with the staff privately at a small coffee shop 2 blocks from La Maison. They gathered in ones and twos, careful not to draw attention. Marcus arrived last, still wearing his chef's coat, his eyes tired but determined. "Thank you all for coming," Keanu began, his voice gentle but carrying authority. "I've been watching what's happening at La Maison, and I think it's time we talked about it." The staff exchanged nervous glances, years of practiced silence hard to break. Maria spoke first, her hands wrapped tightly around her coffee cup. "Mr. Morrison wasn't always like this," she said softly. "When I started 5 years ago, he was different. Strict, yes, but not cruel. Something changed when his wife left him last year." "That's no excuse," Marcus interjected, his voice rough with emotion. "I've watched him break people's spirits for 20 years. Good people, hard workers. Remember Thomas, the sommelier who quit last month? Best wine knowledge in the city. But Carl couldn't stand that he came from a working-class background." The young busboy who had dropped the glass, Jimmy, spoke up timidly. "My mom's sick. I need this job for her medical bills. But sometimes, the way Mr. Morrison treats us..." His voice trailed off, and Maria placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. Keanu listened intently, making mental notes. "Tell me about the regular customers," he prompted. "The ones Carl approves of." A bitter laugh came from Sarah, one of the senior servers. "Oh, you mean the acceptable ones. All flash, no substance. Half of them don't even pay their bills on time. But they wear the right clothes, drive the right cars, so Carl treats them like royalty." Meanwhile, Marcus added, "genuine people like James Thompson get humiliated. Do you know James has quietly paid for 3 of our staff members' emergency medical procedures? Never asks for recognition, never expects anything in return." The group fell silent as a couple walked past the coffee shop window. Once they passed, Keanu leaned forward. "What would it take," he asked carefully, "to make things right?" "A miracle," someone muttered. But Marcus shook his head. "No," he said firmly. "What we need is exposure. Carl's carefully crafted image needs to crack. He needs to face the consequences of his actions." Keanu nodded slowly, a plan forming in his mind. "What if," he suggested, "we could show him exactly how it feels to be judged solely on appearances, to have your worth determined by a single glance?" The staff listened intently as Keanu outlined his idea. By the time they left the coffee shop, hope had replaced resignation in their eyes. Something was about to change at La Maison, and Carl Morrison wouldn't see it coming. The following evening, Keanu arrived at La Maison wearing deliberately shabby clothes, torn jeans, a stained t-shirt, and scuffed work boots. His usually well-groomed hair was messily pushed under a worn baseball cap. He'd studied Carl's patterns, knowing the owner would be manning the front desk during the evening rush. The restaurant hummed with its usual sophisticated energy as Keanu approached. Carl's reaction was immediate and predictable. "I'm sorry, sir," he said, his voice dripping with rehearsed politeness masking obvious disdain. "We're fully booked this evening." "I have a reservation," Keanu replied softly, keeping his head down, "under the name John." Carl glanced at the reservation book, his lip curling when he found the name. "Ah, yes, John. Tell me, what made you think La Maison would be appropriate for someone of your—" He paused meaningfully. Circumstances?" The dining room had grown quiet, attention shifting to the confrontation. Maria and Marcus watched from their stations, fighting to hide their anticipation. Carl, emboldened by the attention, continued his performance. "Perhaps I can recommend somewhere more suited to your budget. There's a charming little diner just down the street. They don't have a dress code," Carl suggested, his voice thick with mockery. "We maintain certain standards here." "Standards?" Keanu asked, finally lifting his head. "Like judging people based on their clothes, or humiliating your staff. Those kinds of standards, Mr. Morrison?" Carl's face flushed with anger. "How dare you question my—" He stopped abruptly as Keanu removed his cap, recognition dawning in his eyes. The restaurant fell completely silent. "Keanu Reeves," he said quietly, letting his voice carry through the hushed room. "I've been watching you, Mr. Morrison, watching how you treat people, how you broke James Thompson's dignity, how you crush your staff's spirit, how you've created a temple to superficiality instead of hospitality." Carl's face had drained of color. "Mr. Reeves, I had no idea. Please, let me show you to our finest table." He gestured frantically to his staff, but no one moved. "That's the problem," Keanu continued, his voice steady. "You treat people differently based on who you think they are. But I've seen the real VIPs in this restaurant, like James, who silently helps others while you mock him, or Marcus, who maintains his dignity despite your constant belittlement." Phones had emerged throughout the dining room, recording the confrontation. Carl's carefully constructed world was crumbling before his eyes. News of Keanu Reeves's confrontation with Carl Morrison spread like wildfire across social media. Shaky phone videos captured the moment the Hollywood star exposed the restaurant owner's prejudice, and within hours, #La Maison Shame was trending. "Absolutely disgusting behavior from the owner," read one viral tweet, accompanied by footage of Carl's interaction with both James and Keanu. This is how they treat people when they think cameras aren't watching? The local news picked up the story, running segments that contrasted La Maison's prestigious reputation with Carl's questionable behavior. Former customers began sharing their own experiences, creating a damaging pattern that couldn't be ignored. "Reservation canceled," posted a prominent food critic. "Any establishment that judges worth by appearance has forgotten the true meaning of hospitality." Other influencers followed suit, their public denouncements sending shockwaves through LA's restaurant scene. Carl retreated to his office, frantically calling his PR team. Through the glass walls, he watched as customers requested their checks early, some leaving without touching their meals. His carefully curated reputation was dissolving before his eyes. "This is your fault," he snapped at his staff during an emergency meeting. "If you had maintained proper standards, warned me about Reeves." His voice trailed off as he noticed their expressions, not fearful anymore, but almost pitying. "No, Mr. Morrison," Maria spoke up, her voice steady. "This happened because you forgot the most basic standard of all, human dignity." Several others nodded in agreement, their silence of years finally breaking. The phone wouldn't stop ringing. Cancellations, media requests, angry former patrons. La Maison's social media pages were flooded with negative comments, each one chipping away at the restaurant's elite status. Marcus watched from the kitchen as Carl paced frantically, barking orders that no one seemed eager to follow anymore. 20 years, the chef muttered to himself. 20 years of watching him break people. Maybe now he'll understand what it feels like to be judged unfairly. By evening, local news vans had parked outside, their cameras trained on the restaurant's entrance. Regular customers slipped away through the back door, not wanting to be associated with the controversy. The few who remained seemed more interested in witnessing the drama than enjoying their meals. "Our reservations for the next month," the maitre d' reported quietly. "They're down by 60%, and the cancellations keep coming." Carl slumped in his expensive leather chair, his perfectly tailored suit suddenly feeling like a costume rather than armor. In the midst of the chaos, a single email arrived from an unexpected source. KEANU Reeves' management team. Carl opened it with trembling fingers, hoping for a chance at damage control. Instead, he found something far more challenging. An invitation to confront the truth about himself and his actions. The morning after the viral incident, KEANU sat in a quiet cafe across town, waiting. He'd asked James Thompson to meet him, hoping to right the wrongs inflicted at La Maison. The door chimed and James entered, looking uncertain but dignified in his usual modest attire. "Mr. Reeves," James said softly, extending his hand. "I must admit, I was surprised by your invitation." KEANU gestured to the chair across from him, his manner warm and welcoming. "Please, call me KEANU, and thank you for coming." The waitress brought coffee, and for a moment, both men sat in comfortable silence. "I saw what happened at La Maison," James finally said. "Both times, though I suspect you planned the second incident." A slight smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Sometimes people need to see themselves clearly," KEANU replied, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "But I didn't ask you here to discuss Carl Morrison. I want to know your story, James. The real one." James looked down at his cup, considering. "There's not much to tell. I made my fortune in accounting, but after my wife Catherine passed..." He paused, collecting himself. "She taught me that wealth means nothing if it doesn't serve others." As James spoke, sharing stories of the families he'd helped, the lives he'd touched, KEANU listened intently. He learned about the scholarship fund James had established anonymously, the medical bills he'd paid, the small businesses he'd saved from bankruptcy. The clothes, the modest dining habits, James explained. Their choices. Every dollar saved is another dollar that can help someone in need. Catherine always said true wealth isn't about what you have, but what you give. "Last month," James continued, his voice softening, "I helped a young woman start her own bakery. Her mother had passed away, leaving her the family recipes but no money to make her dream come true. The joy in her eyes when she hung that 'open' sign? That's worth more than any fancy meal or expensive suit." Keanu leaned forward, his expression earnest. "That's exactly why I wanted to meet you. What happened at La Maison, it's not just about one restaurant or one owner. It's about changing how people see worth and dignity." "You didn't have to get involved," James said quietly. "Most people would have just walked away." "That's the problem," Keanu responded, his voice firm. "Too many people walk away, but change happens when someone stands up, speaks out." He pulled out his phone, showing James something that made the older man's eyes widen in surprise. "Are you sure about this?" James asked, studying the screen. Keanu nodded, his determination evident. "Absolutely. The question is, will you help me? I have a plan that could transform not just La Maison, but the way our entire community thinks about wealth, status, and human dignity." James studied Keanu's face, seeing the genuine commitment in his eyes. After a moment, he smiled and nodded. "Catherine would have loved this," he said softly. "Count me in." La Maison's once bustling dining room sat half empty, the crystal chandeliers casting shadows over vacant tables. Carl Morrison stood at his usual post, watching as another group of regular customers walked past without a glance. His empire was crumbling, and for the first time in his life, he felt powerless to stop it. "3 more cancellations for tonight," the maitre d' reported quietly. "And Chef Marcus says 4 servers called in their resignations this morning." Carl's jaw tightened, his perfectly manicured fingers drumming against the reservation book. The sound echoed through the eerily quiet restaurant. The viral video of Keanu Reeves's confrontation had spawned dozens of news articles, each one diving deeper into La Maison's toxic culture. Former employees emerged from the shadows, sharing stories of verbal abuse and discrimination that stretched back years. Food critics who had once praised the restaurant's exclusivity now condemned its elitism with scathing reviews that circulated widely on social media. "It's a temporary setback," Carl announced during the staff meeting, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Once this social media frenzy dies down, our loyal customers will return." But his words rang hollow in the nearly empty restaurant. Even his most steadfast supporters had begun distancing themselves, not wanting their reputations tarnished by association. Maria watched from the corner as another family approached the entrance, read the recent reviews on their phone, and turned away. "Mr. Morrison," she ventured carefully, "maybe we should consider some changes. A new approach to—" "Changes?" Carl snapped, his facade cracking. "This restaurant has thrived for 15 years because of my standards. I won't let some Hollywood actor and a bunch of social justice warriors destroy everything I've built." His voice echoed through the empty dining room, making him sound more desperate than commanding. The rival restaurant down the street, Le Bistro, had started a "Everyone Welcome" campaign that was drawing crowds. Their chef, a former La Maison employee who'd quit years ago, was giving interviews about the importance of inclusive dining experiences. Each day brought news of another competitor capitalizing on La Maison's downfall. Marcus emerged from the kitchen, his usual calm demeanor masking deep concern. "The suppliers are asking for payment in advance now," he reported. "They've heard about our situation, and 3 of our best wine distributors have terminated their exclusive contracts." He placed a stack of invoices on Carl's desk, each marked with urgent payment notices. The restaurant's financial situation was becoming dire. Regular customers had vanished, taking their generous spending with them. The prestigious events and private parties that had been La Maison's backbone were being canceled one by one. Each day brought new cancellations, more resignations, and mounting bills. Carl slumped into a chair, his perfectly pressed suit wrinkled from hours of stress. On his phone, social media continued to buzz with hashtags like #LaMaisonKarma and #DignityForAll. Each notification felt like another nail in his restaurant's coffin. The very platform that had once spread his restaurant's elite reputation was now broadcasting its shame to the world. "Perhaps," the maitre d' suggested gently, "we could reach out to Mr. Reeves's team, try to make amends." Carl's response was a bitter laugh. "Grovel to them? Never. We'll weather this storm on our own terms." But even as he spoke, another group of potential customers walked past the window, phones in hand, reading the latest reviews. The kitchen, once alive with the sounds of busy preparation, now stood mostly silent. Half the cooking stations were empty, their usual occupants having sought employment elsewhere. The remaining staff moved like ghosts through their duties, jumping at every sound that might signal another customer leaving. As the evening wore on and more tables sat empty, even Carl couldn't deny the truth. La Maison was dying, not from external attacks, but from the poison of its own prejudice. The very exclusivity he had cultivated so carefully had become his undoing, and there seemed to be no way to stop the spiral of decline. The abandoned warehouse district sparkled with unexpected life as string lights twinkled overhead, transforming the industrial space into something magical. Long tables draped in simple white cloth stretched across the concrete floor, each set with mismatched plates and silverware collected from local thrift stores. KEANU had arranged everything meticulously, a community dinner that would bring together people from all walks of life. The guest list was deliberately diverse. CEOs sat next to janitors, celebrities alongside street vendors. The only rule was that no one could wear formal attire. "Are you sure about this?" James asked, adjusting his usual worn button-down shirt. KEANU nodded, surveying the scene with satisfaction. Sometimes the best way to teach empathy is to remove the barriers people hide behind. Local chefs, including several who had quit La Maison over the years, had volunteered their services. The menu was a beautiful contradiction: haute cuisine served on paper plates, fine wines poured into mason jars. The air filled with the aroma of expertly prepared dishes and the sound of genuine laughter. Marcus, who had finally resigned from La Maison that morning, commanded the makeshift kitchen. His eyes sparkled as he directed his volunteer staff, free at last to cook with joy rather than pretension. "Food should unite people," he announced, plating another masterpiece, "not divide them." Maria and other former La Maison staff worked the crowd, sharing stories and serving dishes with genuine warmth. The atmosphere was electric, a celebration of humanity in all its beautiful, messy diversity. Local news crews captured everything, their cameras focusing on the unlikely mixing of social classes. "Ladies and gentlemen," KEANU addressed the crowd, his voice carrying naturally through the space. "Tonight isn't about status or appearance. It's about community, about recognizing the worth in every person who walks through these doors." He gestured to James, who stood quietly near the kitchen. "This man, who some deemed unworthy of respect because of his clothes, has done more for this community than anyone I know. Tonight, we celebrate not just him, but everyone who's ever been judged unfairly." The warehouse erupted in applause as James stepped forward, his usual humility evident even in this moment of recognition. KEANU continued, his voice growing passionate. "Look around you. Every person here has a story, has value, has dignity. The clothes we wear, the cars we drive, the restaurants we can afford, none of that defines our worth." The crowd murmured in agreement as servers brought out more dishes, each one a masterpiece of culinary art served without pretension. Children ran between tables, their laughter mixing with the classical quartet playing in the corner. A homeless man shared his food review with a Michelin-starred chef, both grinning at their unexpected connection. But before KEANU could continue, a murmur rippled through the crowd. Carl Morrison stood in the entrance, looking lost without his usual elegant surroundings. His expensive suit seemed out of place among the deliberately casual attire, and for once, he appeared genuinely uncomfortable. The warehouse fell silent as Carl Morrison stood awkwardly in the entrance, his Italian suit a stark contrast to the casual atmosphere. All eyes turned to him, including those of the news cameras that had been documenting the event. For once, the usually confident restaurant owner seemed small, diminished by the genuine warmth and community surrounding him. KEANU stepped forward, his expression neutral but not unkind. "Mr. Morrison, I didn't expect you to accept our invitation." Carl shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting around the transformed warehouse. The sight of his former staff, now serving happily alongside volunteer workers, made him flinch. I came to understand, Carl said, his voice lacking its usual authority. The restaurant, La Maison, it's failing. Everything I built, crumbling because... He trailed off, watching as Marcus expertly plated another dish with more joy than he'd ever shown at La Maison. Because you valued appearance over substance, KEANU finished quietly. Come, join us. But first, he gestured to a rack of casual clothes they'd set aside for just such a possibility. Everyone here is equal tonight. No suits, no status symbols. For a moment, Carl hesitated, his hand unconsciously smoothing his expensive lapel. Then, surprisingly, he nodded. Minutes later, he emerged wearing jeans and a simple button-down shirt, looking almost vulnerable without his usual armor of designer labels. James approached, carrying 2 plates of food. Here, he said, offering one to Carl. Marcus prepared this especially for you. The same dish I tried to order that night at La Maison. Carl accepted the plate, his hands trembling slightly. As they sat at one of the long tables, surrounded by the very people Carl had once deemed unworthy of his restaurant, KEANU began his speech. "Look around this room," he commanded, his voice carrying to every corner. "What do you see, Carl?" Carl surveyed the scene, CEOs laughing with street vendors, celebrities sharing wine with teachers, children from different social classes playing together without prejudice. "I see. People," he admitted quietly. "Just people enjoying good food." "Exactly," KEANU replied. "No artificial barriers, no judgment based on clothes or wealth. This is what a restaurant should be, a place where food brings people together, not drives them apart." The evening progressed, and something remarkable happened. Carl found himself engaged in genuine conversations, listening to stories from people he would have previously dismissed. He heard about James's charitable works, learned about the struggles and triumphs of his former employees, and witnessed the pure joy of people simply breaking bread together. "I've been such a fool," Carl whispered, more to himself than anyone else, as he watched Marcus receive a standing ovation for his cooking. "All these years, I thought I was maintaining standards, but I was just building walls." KEANU, overhearing, placed a hand on Carl's shoulder. "It's never too late to tear those walls down," he said softly. "The question is, are you brave enough to try?" The morning after the community dinner, Carl arrived at La Maison before sunrise. The empty restaurant, once his pride and joy, now felt cold and unwelcoming. He stood in the center of the dining room, remembering conversations from the previous night that had shaken him to his core. With trembling hands, he dialed KEANU's number. "I want to make things right," he said without preamble. "But I don't know how." On the other end, KEANU smiled. "Start with an apology, a real one, not to me, but to the people you've hurt." Carl spent the morning making calls. To James first, then to former employees, to customers he'd insulted, to suppliers he'd belittled. Some hung up on him, others listened in stunned silence. A few, including James, offered cautious forgiveness. Each conversation felt like peeling away layers of pride that had accumulated over years of arrogance. By afternoon, Carl had called an emergency staff meeting. The remaining employees gathered, expecting another tirade about standards and image. Instead, they found their boss standing before them, his usual perfectly pressed suit replaced by casual clothing. The transformation wasn't just external, something fundamental had shifted in his demeanor. "I've been wrong," Carl began, his voice rough with emotion. "For years, I've confused exclusivity with excellence, wealth with worth. I've hurt people, good people, because I was too blind to see my own prejudices. Every time I turned someone away, every time I made someone feel small, I wasn't maintaining standards. I was betraying the very essence of hospitality." Marcus, who had come at KEANU's request, watched from the doorway as his former boss continued. "I want to rebuild La Maison," Carl announced, "not as a temple to elitism, but as a place where everyone is welcome. where the only standard that matters is how we treat each other, where good food brings people together instead of driving them apart. The staff exchanged skeptical glances. Years of conditioning didn't disappear overnight. But something in Carl's demeanor had changed, the arrogance replaced by genuine humility. They saw tears in his eyes, something none of them had witnessed before. "I understand if you don't believe me," Carl acknowledged. "I haven't earned your trust, but I'm asking for a chance to prove that people can change, that I can change, that La Maison can become something better than what it was." Maria stepped forward, her voice steady. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Morrison?" Carl took a deep breath. "First, we renovate. Make the space more welcoming, less intimidating. Second, we create a new menu, keeping the quality but making it accessible to everyone. And third," he paused, looking at Marcus, "I want to establish a training program for aspiring chefs who might not be able to afford culinary school. People shouldn't be denied their dreams because of their background or bank account." To everyone's surprise, Marcus smiled. "Now that," he said, "sounds like a restaurant worth working for, a place where food can fulfill its true purpose, bringing people together." 6 months after the viral incident that changed everything, La Maison reopened its doors. The transformation was stunning. Gone were the oppressively formal decorations, replaced by warm lighting and comfortable seating. The dress code sign had been replaced with one that read simply, "All are welcome here." James Thompson sat at his usual spot, no longer relegated to the corner, but prominently placed in the center of the dining room. Around him, a diverse crowd filled every table. Business executives next to construction workers, celebrities beside teachers, all enjoying Marcus's expertly crafted dishes. The air buzzed with genuine laughter and conversation, a far cry from the stuffy atmosphere of old. "It's quite a change," KEANU remarked, joining James at his table. The actor had become a regular patron, often bringing friends from the industry to experience the reformed restaurant. "Carl has surprised everyone, especially me." His eyes swept across the room, taking in the subtle but significant changes that had transformed the space. Indeed, Carl Morrison moved through the restaurant with a new demeanor. He knew every staff member's name, their stories, their dreams. The training program he'd established had already launched 3 aspiring chefs into promising careers, including Maria's younger brother, who now worked alongside Marcus in the kitchen. "Good evening, James," Carl said warmly, approaching their table. His designer suits were gone, replaced by simple professional attire that matched his new philosophy. "Chef Marcus has prepared something special tonight. He's recreating the dish from that first night, but this time with the respect it deserves." As if on cue, Marcus emerged from the kitchen, carrying the plate himself. The dish was a work of art, but it was the chef's proud smile that truly garnered attention. "For our most valued guest," he announced, setting it before James. "A reminder of how far we've come." The restaurant had become a symbol of transformation in the community. Local businesses sought Carl's advice on becoming more inclusive, and food critics praised not just the cuisine, but the atmosphere of genuine welcome. The waiting list for reservations grew longer each week, not because of exclusivity, but because people wanted to be part of something authentic. "You know," Carl reflected, joining them briefly, "I used to think success was measured in dollar signs and celebrity clientele. Now I understand. It's measured in the lives we touch, the barriers we break down." He gestured to a young apprentice chef who was explaining a dish to an elderly couple. "That boy? 6 months ago, he was washing dishes at a diner. Now he's creating his own recipes, pursuing his passion." Through the windows, the sunset painted the sky in brilliant colors, casting a warm glow over the dining room. Children laughed freely between tables. Elderly couples shared meals with young entrepreneurs, and the sound of genuine conversation filled the air. La Maison had become more than a restaurant. It was a testament to the power of change, redemption, and human dignity. In the kitchen, Marcus was teaching a new group of aspiring chefs, his patience and wisdom shaping the next generation of culinary artists. The walls that once displayed pretentious art now showcased photographs of community events successful graduates of their training program, and moments of genuine connection shared over beautiful meals. To new beginnings, James proposed, raising his glass. Around him, staff and patrons alike joined the toast, their voices unified in celebration of a transformation that had touched not just one restaurant, but an entire community. KEANU smiled, knowing that sometimes the greatest changes come from the most unexpected moments of truth. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed someone change for the better? Tell us about it, and don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories of redemption and hope.